Tired of bloating, fatigue and sluggish digestion? Meet your gut's new best friend, NutriHealth 365's microbiome supplement. Restore balance, boost immunity, and feel amazing from the inside out. Smart delay release capsules. Real results. Gut health just got personal.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Tuesday's episode of Trending. I hope you're well. Thank you for joining me this morning, wherever you're watching the show. Right, we're going to start today's episode by talking about the US and Venezuela, because this is something that's been brewing for the last few weeks, and people are looking at it as if it's something that's just started, when in fact, you go back a decade and this has been rumbling for a very, very long time. Now, we're being sold that at this point, the US are essentially in a war with drug cartels coming out of Venezuela. There's been escalating tensions now as the Navy move further and further south towards the Venezuela border and in the seas off of Venezuela to essentially get prepared for war. And what started off as apparently precision strikes on individuals has now turned into something that could escalate into a wider invasion of the country of Venezuela. Obviously, the conservative media in their large numbers are supportive of this in many cases. Some are calling it out, but most aren't. Yeah, I'm interested to look back at where this began, or where it started to begin in 2014 under the presidency of Barack Obama. Now, I remember this, where there was elections held and President Maduro, who is still the president in Venezuela, was claimed to have rigged the election. There was mass protests, apparently, against his leadership. And the US then recognized a different person, an opposition leader, as the president of Venezuela. And he was in and out of the US talking to officials, while the military, however, in Venezuela remained aligned to Maduro. So as a result, nothing actually happened. A coup never took place. And it reminded me of the situations that we have seen over the years in countries like Syria, countries like Libya, countries like Iraq, where there's been a regime that the West, that the cult wanted to overthrow. They arm and fund rebels on the other side of the argument. Those people then attack government institutions, attack government military positions, military bases, and so on. And then when the government respond, there's the whole premise of he's killing and attacking his own people. We need to go in and regime change in this country. We saw it with those nations that I just mentioned. There was never any kind of discourse or any explanation as to who was funding the rebels that then attacked government forces and started this. We saw this in Syria. There was no discussion over who funded those people, when if you look at who funded those people, you're looking at America, you're looking at Britain, you're looking at Israel, you're looking at NATO. It's almost certainly the same situation here in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is economically a very poor country, but a very rich country in natural resources. And in 2014, they didn't get their movement off the ground to walk in and take over and overthrow the government and install a puppet. They tried, but they didn't get that off the ground. And then since then, it went very, very quiet. You didn't really hear too much about Venezuela. You heard talks about the drug cartels, which I'm not disputing are obviously a problem. But there's also drug cartels in other nations in South America as well, including Mexico, and there's no talk of the US invading those nations. Certainly not as publicly as this. And so since the last few months, as I say, there's been more and more talks and more demonization of Venezuela. But there's been no direct talks, there's been no discussions with the regime there to try and get a grip on the problem that the US see of Venezuelan drug cartels. And instead, it's just essentially, there's been a war declared, but without declaring a war, because there's been strikes on what they're saying are drug cartel positions and boats and ships, but there's also evidence that they've been targeting civilian ships as well, or certainly that civilians have been caught in the crossfire of this. So this story here this morning is from the Daily Mail here in the UK. Venezuela captures, in brackets, CIA agents amid fears of an all-out war, as a Republican senator warns Trump's boat strikes are setting a chilling precedent. Venezuela has claimed that it's captured CIA agents as America's presence in the Caribbean sparked a furious backlash from inside Donald Trump's own party. So there's essentially a number of different things on play here. So socialist tyrant, because they're trying to tell you what to think about this guy, Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, claimed on Sunday that a group of mercenaries were preparing a false flag attack intended to spark all-out war with the US. The Venezuelan government did not release any evidence or details about this, the number of suspects arrested, their nationalities, and where they were apprehended. Now, it's interesting that use of language there when he talks about false flag attacks, because if you look at so many of the conflicts we've seen across the world, a catalyzing event, which you ask a few questions about and it falls apart, are almost invariably used to create the conflict. You know, whether it's Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, whether it's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to name just a few, whether it's chemical weapons in Syria. There's very little evidence when you actually look at it to support any of those claims. However, all of those kicked off major conflicts. So you don't necessarily need to be telling the truth. You just need people, or enough people, to believe that what you're saying is the truth, and you get the public support. However, times are changing, I feel. I think, you know, those things I just described were a number of years ago, the chemical weapons being the most recent within the last decade. But I do think more and more people now are starting to question the mainstream media and government institutions, because trust in these institutions is at an all-time low. And I'd say that's pretty much across the world. So when something is claimed, I think a lot more questions are asked. I don't believe, for example, the weapons of mass destruction argument they used in 2003 to invade Iraq, I don't think they'd get away with that now. Now, a good few million marched against that war way back in 2003. I think if they tried that today and talked about an all-out war and used a pretext of something like weapons of mass destruction, I think public support would be considerably less than it was even then. So that I see as a positive. But what that does mean is that the propaganda they use to try and get people to support conflict is going to be more intense, and you know, maybe there actually will be real events that will happen, not necessarily orchestrated by who they claim, that create this. You know, things like 9/11 that we talk about, they happened. A false flag attack doesn't mean it didn't happen. They of course happened. 7/7 bombings happened. But who did them and how they were orchestrated and to what end, that wasn't what we're told. And that's what we mean by false flag attack. We're not saying things didn't happen. In some instances, there is evidence that certain things that are claimed happened didn't happen. However, in most they have, but who is behind them is not who we are being told is behind them. That's just to clarify, that's what false flag attack means when I describe it, because you get quite a lot of intense backlash from people saying, oh, so you're saying no one died? That's disrespectful. I've not said that at all. I know people have died. I've been to the 9/11 museum 3 times. It's a very, very dark place. It's a very, very sobering place when you think about the loss of life. And that's why, actually, I think it's more respectful to want justice for those people. And you can apply that to any of these terror attacks that we've seen, any of these false flag attacks that we've seen across the world. I think it's actually more disrespectful to just accept the official narrative when there's so many holes in it. And the people that are really behind this continue to go on doing the same thing again and again. So the reason I mentioned that is that false flag attack narrative or wording that Maduro has used there has kind of, it's set a bit of a challenge, I would suggest, if that's what the US were planning, was to have some kind of event that then led them to go, well, look, we have to go and invade now. Well, he's kind of got out ahead of them. So now if there is such an event, I'm sure the press will do their best to bury this, but if there is such an event, then Maduro can come out and say, look, I warned. I said this was going to happen and this has happened. So it massively diminishes the argument. It massively diminishes the impact of such an event. The Venezuelan regime are claiming that there's a plot of US ships that have been moved into Trinidad and Tobago to refuel just 7 miles off the coast of Venezuela. And it's the largest US warship assembly group in the region since the Cold War, when obviously the Russians had good relationships with Cuba, and the US military presence in the Caribbean was quite high. So it's clear that they're planning something. It's clear that something is coming next. It's not a case of that they're targeting particular groups, and once they've done that, they've done that. There's clearly more to come. And the reason that this is so important is because all those years ago in 2014, as I mentioned, when this really began, this demonization of Venezuela, there was no public support for it. There was a lot of opposition in the US, particularly from the right, and the Republicans about getting involved in yet another overseas regime change war. As since 2001, when they went into Afghanistan, we have seen war after war after war after war that's left millions of American soldiers either having lost their lives or back home with war wounds. Obviously, it's cost billions, probably trillions of taxpayers' dollars in America, caused devastation in the Middle East, and led to basket case countries like Libya, like Afghanistan, and like Iraq today, and caused everlasting damage to generations and generations of people in those countries. So there's not an appetite for another one, and there certainly wasn't in 2014. During Obama's administration, when he took over in 2008, you had the war in Libya, you've had the airstrikes in Syria, you've had airstrikes in Yemen, in Somalia, and other countries, and Iraq, and Lebanon, I believe. Obama once bombed 9 countries in one day, and somehow won the Nobel Peace Prize. Kind of shows you how inverted the world is. But it wasn't an appetite at all. Donald Trump got elected on the premise of being the peace president. He then, to be fair, in his first administration, didn't start any new wars. He then, during his second one, has been involved in Iran. He's been involved in Gaza, maybe not militarily, but certainly involved in giving military equipment to Israel. He's been involved in Yemen. He's now involved in a war or potential war that's come really out of left field in Venezuela. And the fact that you've got people within the Republican Party who don't support this, like we're seeing here, the fact that you've got the right-wing conservative media that would have been very America first, apparently, focus on our own country first, are now all of a sudden very quiet or actively supporting the concept of an overseas war in Venezuela. And it's interesting here that this story mentioned that the Venezuelan government did not release any evidence about various claims that Maduro's made, like the false flag attack and so on. What evidence did the Trump regime release about so many of the things that they claim? They simply don't. They simply say things and hope that people won't actually do the research to look into whether it's actually got any validity or not. That's essentially Donald Trump. Stand up, say something, posture, make it sound important, make yourself feel important, and hope that people take it at face value. When you've only got to look at a lot of the actions to say they completely contradict with, firstly, what was said pre-election, what's been said post-election, what's been said by many of his supporters, and the words of his supporters contradict what they would have said about Obama, what they would have said about Biden. We live in a very, very weird time, to say the least. Like I said, we live in a time when somebody that bombed 9 countries in one day has got a Nobel Peace Prize in Barack Obama. That's the country. That's the sort of the world that we live in. But I'm intrigued to see what happens here, because Trump's obviously got elected, as I said, on the premise of no overseas wars, of fixing the conflicts that we have across the world in Russia and Ukraine, which he's not managed to do, in Israel and Gaza, which he's only managed to do I'd say temporarily and very much in favour of the Israelis. However, trying to justify a full-scale overseas war is something that he has never had to do before during his presidency. And I think he's going to struggle to. When you get elected based on being a peace president, or the argument of being a peace president, and that's the illusion or perception that people have of you, going to invade a country that's not threatening yours, that militarily is minute in comparison to yours, while your country is crumbling in many ways, people are struggling financially, and people have got, long enough memories to remember the wars in the Middle East and North Africa and the devastation that caused to American soldiers and those countries as well, and the financial impact on the American economy. People are going to remember those things. It's a very difficult sell. And the false flag attack comment from the Venezuelan president, I can't get out of my head. When I first read that, I thought, it's what they've done so many times previously. The warships there, 7 miles off the Venezuelan coast, it mentions. Okay, so if there's a missile attack on one of those ships and an American soldier gets hit or an American ship gets hit, and it's blamed on Venezuela or a separatist group in Venezuela or whatever they want to say, well, there's your war. That's exactly what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. That's exactly what happened on a large scale in Pearl Harbor. It's very, very clear that they don't care about their own people. They will sacrifice a few of them if they have to get what they want. And what they obviously want here is a conflict. What they obviously want is a large scale conflict. There's another option as well on this, which I think is worth mentioning, which is that when there is a public debate or a public feeling about something that is not what you want, quite often they will chuck in another event to distract you and stop people talking about this. So across Europe, there's lots of people talking about Israel's actions in Gaza and quite rightly calling it out. But in America, there's obviously a massive Israeli influence within American politics and American culture. You know, a lot of America consider Israel like a little brother, a little cousin that they have to look after. And the public support, particularly from the Judeo-Christian movement, the Christian Zionists, is that we must always protect Israel's right to exist. And, you know, they don't do that. They do far more than that in terms of giving them money and the influence that they have in the Senate and the Congress and the president. But at the moment, that is being questioned by a lot of people. That is being reviewed, particularly within the younger demographic in America, who are seeing the actions of the Israeli regime and quite rightly being disgusted by it. Now, all of a sudden, if there's a conflict in Venezuela, where the Americans are going in for an invasion, there's going to be a lot more people talking about that and a lot less people focusing on what's going on in the Middle East and a lot less people questioning Israel because they're going to have something else to occupy the forefront of their minds. So don't rule that part out as well. I remember years and years ago, it would have been, mid-early noughties, and you had Israel, once again, bombing heavily in Gaza and the West Bank. And I remember this was going on for about 3 or 4 days. And it was mainstream news. It was the top story on the BBC, on all these things. Every single news bulletin, it was the top story. And then all of a sudden, I remember waking up one morning and the BBC News saying that there was a UK terror alert and that the potential for a terror attack in the UK was imminent and the threat level had been raised to critical. What do you think happened for the next 48 hours? Well, the stories involving Israel all of a sudden disappeared to News Bulletin 3 or 4. They weren't the front page. They weren't the top of the thing on everybody's lips when they were talking. It was people being worried about an imminent threat to their own safety. That occupied their minds more, of course. Now, that stuck with me because that was so blatantly a way of trying to bury the story they didn't want people talking about. So give them something else to worry about that means more to them. Well, at the moment, if you've got people in America talking about what's going on in the Middle East, that's something thousands of miles away from home. That's not something happening on their shores. It's not their brothers or sisters or mums or dads or sons or daughters that are being sent to fight in that conflict. Well, yeah, anyway. So it's something that's an extension. Whereas you take an American military conflict, just not too far from home, really, down in South America, where there's American military personnel being sent there, where there's attacks on American military personnel, there's impacts on the American economy, all of a sudden that's going to come to the forefront of your mind a lot more than what's going on over there. So I would not be surprised. All cards are on the table here. Could there be a full-scale invasion and a regime change, which they've clearly wanted since back in 2014 and previous? Possibly. Could this be a lot of posturing to distract you from talking about something else and have this to occupy your mind for the next few weeks? Quite possible as well. Could there be something in the middle? Quite possible. But I think it's important when things like this happen to have an open mind, to keep your mind constantly looking for new information that may make you question that a little bit more or may explain that a little bit differently, because we'll get given one narrative by the mainstream media. It's important that we have access to all of them. And as we say always, ask the question, who benefits from this happening and who benefits from me believing what you're telling me about who did it and who is behind it and who is the good guy and who is the bad guy? Because invariably, what they say happened isn't what actually happened. And even more invariably, who they said did it isn't who did it. Right, so thank you very much for tuning in with me if you're with us on YouTube or Twitter. I hope you found that information insightful and hopefully that's given you a slightly different perspective on what you're seeing from the mainstream media. We're going to carry on iconic.com. We're going to talk about school absency fees, and we're going to talk about Reform politician Sarah Ponchin, who's in hot water this week for her comments about the diversity of adverts. So if you click the link in the description below and head over to iconic.com and watch the rest of the episode there.